Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, of the Praise of Folly podcast. I am once again joined by Derrick Jensen. Glad to have you back, Derrick. How you doing?
Oh, it's great to be here. I'm doing okay. How you doing?
Good. So I was thinking about a future topic for an episode, and this one is going to be about nature and God, or nature and the divine. So I'll just begin briefly by defining three broad categories and then get your take on it. As I understand it, you could say that animism is the idea that there are powers and potencies in nature that are worshipped as just forces. Polytheism worships those same potencies, but personifies them as individual agents. And then monotheism is the belief that there's some higher God that stands above all of this. So, would you accept that as a working definition?
Sure.
So, what are some of your thoughts on let's just begin that. Some of your thoughts on the entailments of how each of these, in your perspective, relates to nature.
Well, I can't remember his name now. It's a problem with getting older. I've been having some conversations with this Australian theologian who's really cool, whose name escaped me at the moment. He wrote something like seven lessons in magic or something. And he makes a distinction between basically animists, supernaturalists, transcendentalists, and mechanists. And the mechanists would see no magic anywhere. We can use the word magic here, or he used the word magic. We can also say God. What in this case they're interchangeable, I think. Anyway, so mechanists, and then you have the supernaturalists believe there's no magic in the world, but there is magic elsewhere. And there's the animists who believe there's magic everywhere. And now I'm messing up his handy little chart because I'm forgetting the difference between the transcendentalists and but the key here, I do remember, is that he says the big fight really is not between the transcendentalists who would believe there isn't magic in the world, but there is magic elsewhere. But the big fight would be between the mechanists and everybody else. And I pretty much agree with that.
Right, because the mechanists would say that there's no, for lack of a better word, magic. There's no innate potencies or living qualities in these natural things. They're just...
Or out.
Or out. And I guess you see the interesting thing here then is depending on how you want to relate to these powers in nature. You either worshiping them as forces or worshiping them as persons or seeing them as the result of someone else's work. I think there are certain implications that can follow, right? One is there seems to be a risk of a kind of, we saw this with paganism, so we actually know this, a kind of fatalism that sets in. Because one of the things we see in classical antiquity is that the gods were seen as arbitrary, even though they represented, like Poseidon represents the sea, Zeus represents the sky, so on and so on. And there's this sense in which those forces themselves completely dominate and beat you down. Now, that's not necessarily the case, but that's a sort of mindset that can develop when they're treated that way.
Yes, I want to throw something in there that I recently learned about Stonewall Jackson, the Confederate general in the Civil War. He was, in a sense, utterly courageous in battle. And he said that he feels no more fear going into battle than he would lying down to sleep or sitting down to breakfast. And his actions would indicate that he wasn't lying. And where that came from for him was he was a very devout Christian, and he was a profound believer in preordination. And so if it's not my time, it doesn't actually matter what I do in this battle. And if it is my time, it doesn't matter what I do. And so my point is that the sort of fatalism that you're thinking of? Because that actually derived from Christianity in that case.
Right. So no, that's an interesting point, right? Because there's two, more broadly speaking, so we can step this back. I'll just give a brief overview of this. Within classical antiquity, and we can argue that the polytheistic tradition begins in Egypt, branches out, then the Greeks and the Romans pick it up, because it all circles back around with Alexander. He goes to Egypt, and the priest of Ammon is like, yeah, you're one of us. So it's like there's no difference fundamentally between these different gods. Now the problem is that they're deceptive and they're tricky. So Plato in the Republic criticizes Homer for saying that, well, if there are gods, they wouldn't be like this. They wouldn't be lying to people and sending them up the fall. And that kind of fatalism is like, well, we're just doomed. No matter what we do, these forces that are sitting above us are just going to beat us down. Now, within Christianity, Calvinism specifically, there's a kind of determinism where everything that happens is preordained, good or bad. The presumption being, if you're on God's side in this, then the good things are going to happen to you, but at some point you're going to die still, right? So it's a different kind of fatalism in the sense that it does give you a line out, right? Because if God preordained you to do something great or preordained the day that you die, you can do something great and then go to paradise. That's different than all the gods conspiring against you. You know, maybe you don't do anything and you die and go to Hades, right? There's still some difference in which the predetermination in the classical pagan sense is sort of a saps your strength and will rather than that particular version of Christian fatalism. Because here's the difference, right? The God that is over and above the ordered principles of nature is presumably one that isn't going to lie to you. That's one of the innovations of the Jewish religion, is that, well, unlike the pagan gods, Yahweh isn't going to go around intentionally lying to you to trip you up, like Zeus giving Agamemnon the dream that he could win the battle in Troy when he really wouldn't. And in that situation, that I think is a fundamentally different situation than being predetermined by gods and deities that you can't actually trust.
I'm just thinking about I have to really ruminate on what I think about misleading about these forces or deities misleading, because I
No, to be clear, I'm not saying that the powers of nature are misleading, but in
no, I'm not saying that they're not. I'm thinking about I'm wondering about life itself and just
Yeah, Derrick warned me about this before the show. There's some dogs outside that get rather excited. So, yeah, I'll just sort of lean into this a little bit more. The idea being that in animism, they're just forces. So it's like, okay, well, we can speak of like an electrical current, right? Well, we can't really reason with an electrical current. It just is. Now, hopefully you might be able to manipulate it. But if you can't, well, then you just got to get out of the way of the electrical current. Forces of nature, if they're just go ahead.
what I'm thinking about is there is tremendous amounts of deception in nature. And the reason I know about this is there have been some people who have written, I really disagree with this, but there is a school of thought that holds that humans developed language in order to lie. And I disagree with that on a number of levels, one of which is that you don't need words to lie. And I think of any predator species or prey species in nature who attempts to have camouflage, because that's a form of lying. There is no little fawn here sitting in the grass, and there is no tiger crawling through the grass trying to find the fawn to eat it. And so on a fundamental level, I mean, I don't know if you want to go there, if we want to go there, but I mean, deception ends up. What is the role of deception in nature, and what is the role of deception in? I want to step back for a second and just make explicit for people who are listening and wondering what we're talking about, that part of this came up because you and I were having a discussion, and I am not, I'm not an atheist unless you want to define that word in a way that ends up that I am. Um, it occurred to me many, many years ago that if we substituted the word God, if we just drop in God instead of nature or vice versa in all of my work, it would work out. The work would be fundamentally the same. And the dogs are going to start screaming again. So
No, yeah. So while they're doing that, yeah, you've mentioned that multiple times in previous streams. So I suppose this was only a matter of time before this conversation happened. And one of the things that I wanted to touch on, and we can get back to deception in nature in a moment, but the idea of classically defined, if one defines God and nature as the same, that would be considered pantheism. Well, now that's a perspective that's out there. But one of the things that I want to say though is if we look at all of the things in nature and in visible existence and sense, they would you agree? Well, first of all, would you agree with this principle that something is the explanation for a thing's existence is either itself or something external to itself?
So doesn't that by definition have to be true?
Well, I think it would. I mean, I don't know really what else could explain any given thing. Either the cause is external to the thing or the
Yeah,
cause is internal. So if we have
exactly.
those two categories, I think we would safely agree that all things in nature are, of course, caused by some other external cause. So if an animal's born, then the cause of that animal is its parents, right? If plants are grown, then the cause of that plant is some external factor like the seed being blown by the wind. Because we're talking about wild, not human cultivated. So then the question is, if all things are like that, then we have a problem, which is called the infinite regress problem. How does the process even start if you can't actually have the first thing? And so to get around that, the idea goes that, well, there must be at least one being, which we'll call God, who has existence necessarily. The technical term is aseity, but that would be the explanation for this being's existence is the being himself. So that's how you break the infinite regress cycle. And that's where I'd sort of want to push a little bit on the idea of equating the natural world with God himself. So do you have anything you want to say to that?
Well, I mean, isn't the way the astrophysicists or whomever or the cosmologists deal with that is by invoking a Big Bang, and then people ask, well, what was before the Big Bang, and then they run into the same problem. Isn't that
Well,
how?
no. The difference here is that the Big Bang is a physical effect. So right prior to that, according to modern quantum mechanics, there's something like some sort of, well, depending on if you go multiverse or not, there's a kind of like stasis before the Big Bang. Everything is just not doing anything, and then it explodes. So then the question is, well, if we look at Newton's laws, something is at rest or in action unless acted on by an outside object. What was the outside object that acted on this state to then cause it to change? That creates one aspect of a problem. But what I'm talking about is a metaphysical concept whereby this being that we're reasoning towards must necessarily exist as a grounding and a cause for the other things that we see, specifically in nature.
Yeah, I don't really. Sorry, but I don't really see how, from a mechanistic perspective, that gets them off any hooks. I mean,
Well, I'm
it's.
not saying mechanistic. I mean, I'm not like an atheist or advocating for the Big
Oh,
Bang.
I know that. I'm just saying that from that sort of perspective, it's still just hand waving.
Well, no, right? Because we just agree that there's two kinds of causes for a thing, right? Something external to itself or itself.
No, no, no. I agree with that. I agree with that.
Right.
I'm
So, but if there's a being whose existence is caused by itself, then that would be where everything starts, because that would be just the limit of being, and then all other beings after that could point to that as its source.
Well, see, here's part of the deal is that I think this is taking this a different direction, but I really think that humans are I hate the word hardwired because it's mechanistic, but I'm going to use it here because people know what I'm talking about. I think people are hardwired. I think people have, here's a better way, an inherent need for a belief in some sort of larger being. I think that a lack of a belief in some sort of larger being has been tremendously dysfunctional. And whether that larger being or any number of larger beings, doesn't matter, whether they exist or not, the belief in them, I think, is inherent because the universe is more complex than we're capable of thinking. And the universe, and that's just a way of talking about the those mysteries. We can.
Yeah.
So the growling you're hearing here is one of my dogs is growling at a bear standing just outside the door, and that's why I keep muting, is because
yeah.
when it goes beyond growling, then they start screaming.
Yeah. No, but what I was going to say though, Derek, is okay. I don't disagree that there's this inborn human need for some higher power, but I also think that because there's the inborn need, there's also the satisfaction of that need, because we have inborn needs to eat, we have inborn need to sleep, we have inborn need for social human relations, and there are ways to satisfy and gratify those needs. So I think actually the need itself is evidence of the being himself. Because if we have a need for food, well, then there's actually food out there. If we have a need for sleep, then we're able to sleep. If we have a need for social interaction, that's theoretically possible. So I think actually we could also make an argument from the felt need to the object that satisfies the felt need.
Well, we could argue that, and I think in addition, what I would be comfortable arguing is for the existence of mysteries beyond our comprehension, and of complexities beyond our comprehension. And if those complexities take the form of, well, there's multiple layers here. There's first is just the fact that there are things beyond which there are things. I love the line about how nature's not only more complex than we think, it's more complex than we're capable of thinking. And so there's that. And then in addition, there is something I tried to write about it, and maybe not very successfully, in my book Dreams, which is so one of the things I wrote about in that book is something I called the gambling god, which I found that to this day, I mean, I'm in the middle of one right now, that I like betting on sports, small scale, and I will have times where I'm doing just terribly and times where I'm doing pretty well. And we are a pattern-seeking creature. That's not to say others aren't pattern-seeking creatures as well. And so I try to find meaning in those patterns. And is it just random walk where, you flip a coin and at some point you're going to flip, 8 tails in a row? Or is there, and I felt very vulnerable writing that. I felt very exposed because in the West, everybody would think I'm crazy for talking about how what I do can affect the outcome of the bet. And that's, from a mechanistic perspective, just nonsense. And my niece has a doctorate in traditional Chinese medicine, and she lived in China for many years. She's married to a Chinese man. And she said, basically, everybody in China would agree with me. And this is an absolutely standard belief. And in fact, when she got married, her future in-laws, told her Now, we think you make a really nice couple, but you have always had really good luck. And we have to tell you, he's had very poor luck. And so if you marry him, he may harm your luck. And I know I'm getting off in the weeds here, but well, here's what I want to get at is that a belief that there is nothing larger. It's interesting. First off, it emerged in like 5 places around the world at the same time. And these were all cities. And these were all places that destroyed their land bases pretty early. And I don't know. I'm just rambling about, I guess there's one more thing I want to say about this, which is that I realized in my book Dreams that no matter what is true, a lack of belief in some sort of magic in the universe is unsustainable. No matter what is objectively true, it's unsustainable and harmful to society because one of the things it does is causes. I mean, a lot of people have written about how the Enlightenment led to, quote, the death of nature, where prior to the sort of modern scientific worldview, there was great belief in powers of nature and it affected how we treated nature, because if God is in this tree, or if your ancestors are in this tree, or if, no matter what belief you have, you're less likely to cut down the tree than if the tree is nothing but timber on the stump. And I was just last week talking with a friend about she had a near-death experience that convinced her that there is something in the afterlife. And then we had this interesting discussion about whether or not there is an afterlife. A belief in one makes dying easier. And it is, without addressing what is real at all, but it is comforting. And you know what, on that particular level, what harm does it do to believe in that for somebody who's dying? You know, one more thing about this, which is I don't have a belief in the standard Christianity or Judaism or Islam or any of those. And when I used to teach in the prison, and this was people doing life in prison, there were a fair number of very strong converts. They had not been on the outside. And I could totally understand it, because if the rest of your life is confined to a 6x6 or 8x6 or however big box, then if it makes you survive that better by having a belief in that after you die, you're going to have a better time, as opposed to you're going to live in this box for the next 50 years and then and then nothing. I don't know. Well, I'm getting way off topic, so put me back on topic.
Yeah, well, let's sort of circle back to an earlier point you made about nature being deceptive. So one of the things that you like to talk about is mimics, and of course, mimicry is by definition very deceptive, right? You've got non-venomous, non-dangerous creatures giving the signal that they are, right? And of course, also you have ambush predators and others trying to hide themselves. So they're present, but they're trying to be present in a way in which you don't see them as present. And then also, this isn't strictly speaking deception. It's just somebody misreading the signals, but it can be construed this way. Let's use a good example like sailing, right? You might think you can read the winds, and maybe you can, but maybe just not good enough. And then you shipwreck your ship. Now you could.
And why can't the winds be deceptive too?
That's true too. I mean, they could just change on a dime, but so that's true.
No. Actually deceptive. It's like, hey, let's get this guy over here and then let's mess with him. Well, except now we're ending up in the pantheon territory.
Polytheism. Yeah, we're ending up with that. But yeah, so here's the thing, right? If you build your view of God based on either animism or polytheism, which I view as basically deriving certain concepts of God from the natural forces itself, it creates a kind of moral vacuum where people are either at best ambivalent towards deception. They're at best ambivalent to it, and at worst they endorse it. So, like for example, the Greek hero Ulysses leans hard into that. And, there's divine sanction, right? Zeus is a deceiver, other gods are deceivers, and it's like, oh, I'm just doing what they do. And they represent, of course, natural forces. They're just personified. And so it creates a kind of, on the one hand, moral vacuum, and on the other hand, sort of moral depression where people are just depressed and frightened. And I would argue that if God is no more than nature, then we do run into some problems. I would argue that a conception of God would have to move beyond just what we see. Not that nature doesn't reflect an already existing divine essence. Of course it does. But I don't think you can merely just from the experience of nature stop there and say, okay, we're not going to go any higher.
Why?
Well, for the first reason, let's just deal with the first reason, the moral problems and social problems that develop. First of all, do you agree with my interpretation of how a certain polytheism sort of evolved over time with regards to telling the truth and other things because of nature?
I think that the stories that we tell ourselves and that we tell each other are the stories that last through time, tell us something about any story that lasts through time resonates with our social experience in some way, or it wouldn't resonate through time. I can tell you a story, and if it doesn't resonate with you, you're not going to tell it to your friends. I can tell you a story that resonates somehow or another, and you will propagate that. And so I think that, and this is all basically just Joseph Campbell's Hero of the Thousand Faces, that I think that I went through a period in my early 20s where I read Grimm's fairy tales and fairy tales from all the cultures I could get my hands on, just because I was so interested in that notion of how culture is perpetuated. And there will be parts that will be different in different cultures because people are different in different cultures. And there will be parts that will be pretty universal to these because humans have, when I interviewed Joseph Campbell when I was 23, and one of the things he said that I thought was I thought was completely nuts at the time, but I really like now, is he said that I asked, what is the source of archetypes? And he said that there are organs like your kidney is the source of one archetype or something. And at first, at 23, that's like, haha, that's pretty funny. But I really like, I was later reading some Jung, and he said something about how at base, unconsciousness is carbon. And what I'm trying, not very successfully, to talk about here is how
Yeah, the bear's back, guys. The bear's back. So while the bear's back, I'll try to maybe reframe the question to help focus this back on. if we look at animism and polytheism as two types of expression of religion rooted very strongly in these visceral, intimate experiences with nature, what I think we end up having with in the long run, and I think in part why these two forms of religious expression eventually started to fade away, is it creates a sort of sense of hopelessness where man is merely at the mercy of these forces, either because they're forces and can't be placated at all, or because they're capricious persons who, like the Olympians, who will just screw you over in a pinch because why not? And even before go ahead.
But I think that's life, that you can be having a great life. Okay, so I live in the Redwoods, and there's a place where I drive sometimes where I just remember that there was a tourist couple 5-6 years ago who were just driving along, and one of the trees fell on them. And sometimes life is just, you can be having a great life and doing everything fine, and you're walking down the street and you have a heart attack and die, or what's the famous thing about the birds flying overhead and drops a turtle on his head?
Yeah, I think it was Empedocles. Yeah, the Greek philosopher. Yeah.
So sometimes I think that there is. I mean, sometimes I think things just happen.
Well, sure, but I mean, is that? But I guess what I would want to ask you though is that. Let me try to rephrase this in another way. So Rene Girard says that he's not speaking as a Christian, but certain ideas, concepts, and teachings of Christ and the Christian religion have percolated out to non-Christian, other religions, philosophies, belief systems that aren't Christian, and they want to hold on to some of it, on other parts of it. Nietzsche heavily criticizes that in some of his own writings, but the point is, those aspects that are the more humanitarian aspects that people like to preserve from Christianity, even if they don't still hold to that religion, are not really beliefs you're going to derive from nature itself, because those are not really beliefs we saw developed in like the pagan Hindu caste system in India, ancient Egypt, or the Greeks and the Romans. And so that would seem to indicate there needs to be an explanation for where they came from.
I would point out that all of those were cosmopolitan religions, by the way.
Well, they were syncretistic. They would recombine with each other, but I think that's just because
not actually. I'm sorry, I was not meaning cosmopolitan in that sense. Sorry about that. What I was meaning is those are all religions of cities.
Of cities. Got it. Right. Well, I mean, even though, not Druidism. That was a religion.
Oh, right.
Right. Yeah, that was not of cities, but again, Druidism ruled through threats of human sacrifice, to the god Crom Cruach. So this is a pretty dark, religion to have. And let's stick to the Celts, right? This is a good example. Now let's look at Celtic Christianity, insular Christianity, with St. Brendan, St. David, all these guys. Compare them to the bloodthirsty Druids. And there seems to be a stark difference, even though they're the same people, right? They're still Britons. They're still the same people, but there seems to have been a fundamental change effected.
So what point are you making?
Well, the point that I'm making is that the sort of higher ethical, higher moral principles develop when one approaches or approximates monotheism, because it gets to a point over and above the mere struggle for survival that we see in the natural forces.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would agree with that.
No, I'm not. I'm also not arguing that's solely Christian, because pagan polytheism was dying in the Roman Empire even before the rise of Christianity. The three great schools of thought, the Platonists, who called God the One, the Stoics, who called God the Logos, and the Peripatetics, who called God the Prime Mover, all were converging on this idea of a single divine being that created everything, over and above the gods of Olympus. So this was actually happening even before the Christianization of the Roman Empire. And I'm arguing that these there are moral truths that we all take for granted that were the byproduct of this evolution in thought with regards to nature and God.
So what is the function of any religion in your perspective?
Well, we can talk about it in a sense of utility, and we can talk about it in a sense of truth. But I'll talk about it in a sort of moral sense, right? So I think, generally speaking, us in the West would look at religions and grade them in part on the level of moral development. So if you're sacrificing humans, like,
No, I mean more basically.
okay,
Like not. Well, I'll tell you my version.
sure, go ahead, do that first.
That I think the function of a religion is to tell you and this is what a good religion, a bad religion, any religion, it's to tell you how to live in your community, to give you a moral sense, which can be, this would include the Aztecs, and they had a moral sense. It's just we would find that moral sense profoundly immoral. So to teach you how to live communally, how to live in that place, and how to experience the divine. So for me, that's the function of a particular that's the sort of the generic function of a religion, or generic function of all religions, to teach you how to get along with each other, which may be really nastily or maybe really nicely, to how to be in this particular place, and how to experience the divine. So first off, would you more or less agree with that?
No, that's a very, I think, succinct sociological definition. Yeah, that's a good one.
Okay. So when we get to, and I want to be really clear, I'm not suggesting any sort of complete moral relativism with this, that I am not saying that the Aztecs were a better way to live than, I'm saying from their perspective, it obviously worked for a while, but I would find mass human sacrifices objectively atrocious. Okay, where was I going with this? I was responding to you.
The point that I made that you're responding to was, I believe that there's certain moral intuitions and insights that we developed as we socially evolved out of polytheism into monotheism. And one of them that I think you would like is the idea of a more sort of bigger picture, where you just can't go over the hill and sack the village of your rivals. So a lot of the names that we get from Native Americans as they come down, if we hear their version of their own name, it usually translates as the people. And
Right.
then the other tribes are basically the muckety mucks over there. So because the United States fought all of these tribes, they just chose the names their enemies gave them.
Right.
But that's usually how it works on a polytheistic level. Whereas when we get to monotheism, let's look at the invention of the hospital with Basil the Cappadocian in the 4th century. There was medicine, of course, before Christianity, but this was like for soldiers, for wealthy citizens. These hospitals were opened up for the poor, and there was a general consensus that within the Roman Empire, okay, you might have to fight the Germans, but you could also convert them to Christianity and have to avoid to fight them in the first place. Whereas with a polytheist framework, Rome being the major exception, you just keep fighting all these guys because they're just, on the other side of the hill. So what it does is it adds a layer of conflict resolution that didn't prior exist. So like Patrick could convert the Irish rather than just having continued conflict, which had been the norm until then.
I'm not convinced that I'm not convinced that monotheism leads to a decrease in conflict necessarily. I mean, it's not popular to say these days, but Islam has been about, at the very least, strains of Islam have been about taking over the world and converting the entire world into Islam at the point of a sword if necessary. And there certainly have been a lot of Christians who have given others the choice of Christianity or death. And
right. But just to say real quick though, where is the where is the pagan version of Patrick? Where is the pagan version of the saint that goes out to convert somebody? I'm not saying that these groups are perfect and don't commit wars of aggression, but they've added a new layer to the way to relate to other people that didn't prior exist.
Well, see, part of my difficulty, I'm less interested in talking about I'm not sure. For me, a functioning religion would develop in place over hundreds or thousands of years. Hundreds of years is more realistic. And I'm not sure of the necessity of converting others to one's religion. I don't see the need for a Patrick.
Well, but let's think about it this way, right? So in the ancient Mediterranean context, despite the fact that basically the Greek gods, the Roman gods, the Egyptian gods were all sort of seen as interchangeable with each other, there was very little easy ways to de-escalate conflicts. Conflicts would just spiral out of control, and you'd have these 20-year wars like Roman Carthage or something, where there wasn't really a pre-agreed upon way of finding a more peaceful way to resolve this. But what we see with Patrick is that there's now this, as an example, he's not the only one, there's this new tool added to conflict resolution where now you don't have to necessarily go over and raid the other guy, or if he raids you, you don't have to raid back. You can try to change his opinion, shape how he thinks and behaves. And that just didn't exist in classical times or, prehistoric times. You were just going to go, full massacre mode. You're going to go to the other village and just kill all the men and take the women and children back home with you.
Maybe. I just finished reading a really interesting book by John Keegan, History of Warfare. And he talks about how people, it's a very interesting book that he takes the notion that war, the notion that war is an extension of politics by other means, and completely disagrees with it. He says that war is an extension of culture by other means, and that, so he contrasts, for example, the Cossacks, for whom war was highly individualistic, as opposed to the British, for whom it was more regimented, which from where we get the term regiment. And when the British tried to teach the stand in line and all shoot in mass of Napoleonic style warfare to, for example, the Japanese and also the Greeks and the Cossacks, they would all laugh at them because it was incomprehensible to them, this form of warfare. And going farther back, it wouldn't always lead to massacre. One of the examples he gives is the Yanomami, who are extremely warlike and pretty nasty. And he said that they had standard escalations, that the first level, it's always based among them, it's almost always based on personal insult, perceived slight. And the first level is some sort of fairly is individual combat, where two guys will go and they'll hit each other with clubs, and that's the resolution to the insult. And if that doesn't work, then it'll escalate to the next step, and then it'll escalate to the next step, and then eventually it gets to raiding parties where you kill all the men and enslave the women. And but his point was that it didn't always have to turn into that, and it's true with a lot of other people have other peoples have different forms of warfare that don't always lead to a massacre raid. There can be highly formalized. I mean, it's sort of like the story of David and Goliath. That's one possibility. You just send two people out, and not everybody else has to get killed.
Well, we're right, but what I'm getting at though is not necessarily an individual battle, but when two groups of people, two nations, two cultures collide and have a disagreement. Before the Christian era, beginning in the 4th century AD, we don't have any options for nonviolent resolution. Now, the fact that the options that were presented by Patrick and others are not always used isn't an argument against the fact that for the first time they're actually there. And in the 5th, 6th, and 7th centuries, largely out of necessity, they were used a lot because the Germanic kingdoms that invaded were pagan and they had to be reconverted. They weren't, by the time you get to Charlemagne, that's like 400 years later. Charlemagne was long after this has long been established and solidified with his massacre of the Saxons. But the other point then is too, though, I want to go back to the hospital, right? I mean, this institution, which we all take for granted, develops out of the Christian tradition. And it's because there's a shift in perspective of how you treat the least advantage in your society. The ancient pagans were just like, it sucks to be you. If you were a nomad on the steppe, I mean, well, you just got left behind. The horses kept running. I mean, because ultimately, this is something that I know someone like you would definitely strongly argue against. The sort of like far right interpretation of nature red in tooth and claw, the will of the strong survive. But that seems to be how a lot of ancient societies derive their ethics from nature. They did seem to derive it that way.
I think we have. I mean, there are certainly many cases of at some point when someone can no longer keep up with the group, that one would be left behind. That's but I'm having I think we're at cross purposes here some in. I mean, what I thought we were going to talk about today was the I didn't know we were going to talk primarily about pantheism, which is not something about which I care. I'm sorry, about polytheism, which is not something that I particularly care about. And I'm much more interested in the pantheistic version and in the implications of. I mean, it started from the one sentence I said earlier of, I think, we can just substitute in much of what I say, we can substitute the word God for the word nature, and it ends up meaning much the same with a few distinctions between what I perceive as capital N nature and what you might perceive as capital G God. One of them being that I don't think that capital N nature is capital O omniscient. I don't think there is. I think it evolves with everything else. It's just that there is, and it also helped me. I was raised a Christian, Seventh-day Adventist, and I understand those traditions really, in many ways, very well. I certainly don't understand church history 1/100th of what you do. But I at least get the basics. And I heard a great phrase about nature. This is by Paul Stamets, that he says, nature loves a community. And that helped me to make sense of something that, you can look at nature and see some pretty nasty things happening. And and this is a problem. This is a problem in theology. How could God allow the nun to be murdered? How could God allow my wonderful daughter to be stricken with cancer? And for me, the Stamets helped me bring all those together, that I don't think, and whether we call it God or whether we call it nature, it's not, I don't think, see, it's very interesting, because on one hand, I was going to say, I don't think nature primarily cares, it cares about the continuation of the tadpole and frog community, but 99% of those tadpoles are going to get killed before they're adults. It cares about the larger community more than it cares about that individual bad luck tadpole. But on the other hand, there is one of my favorite lines in my life has been, the fates guide those who will, those who won't they drag. And I have been obsessed is too strong a word, but I'm extremely interested in the whole notion of personal and collective fate. And ever since I was very young. And so it's an interesting paradox that my own perspective is that capital N nature, capital G God, whatever you want to call it, does care about communities, and individuals are, we're all born to die. And on the other hand, I do see the hand of fate in many, both individual and personal things.
So I think maybe we should put a bookmark on it here, because I know you have to be somewhere pretty soon. But is there anything, could we count that as your final statement, Derrick, or do you want to add anything before we wrap it up? Well, thanks for coming on, Derrick. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, it's always great. And I'm sorry if I didn't take this the direction you wanted to go.
No, that's okay, Derrick. We're here to explore ideas. So we'll talk to you next time. This is Todd Lewis. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise and Flight podcast, signing off.
Okay. Look forward to it.